So what if every civic duty you feel, paying your taxes, waving your flag, voting in elections, isn't actually a moral triumph at all?
Right.
Like, what if all of it is just a temporary technological glitch, just a byproduct of an industrial era that needed a way to convince millions of people to march into machine gun fire and, well, hand over half their income?
It's a heavy thought.
It is. And today, we are taking a sledgehammer to the 20th century nation-state. We're doing a deep dive into the prophetic, terrifying, I mean deeply controversial 1997 book, The Sovereign Individual by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg.
And we really need to be clear right up front here. This is not a comforting text. The authors use history not as some bedtime story to make us feel good about human progress, but as a scalpel.
Exactly.
They brutally deconstruct how human morality and political structures are merely byproducts of what they call the logic of violence. So our goal today is to bypass the safe, polite academic fluff and just expose the raw, often uncomfortable truths about power, human delusion, and the impending irrelevance of our cherished political systems.
Consider this a warning, honestly. We're going to strip away the moral posturing of modern society. We're looking at a text that basically calls everything you, the listener, believe about society a comforting lie. The civic myths you were raised on, equality, democracy, patriotic duty, they're dissected here as obsolete tools of control.
Which is hard to swallow.
Very. So as you listen today, we are asking you to mentally step outside the system you live in, which is incredibly hard to do because there's an innate, almost biological, societal taboo against anticipating the end of your own civilization.
Yeah, that taboo on foresight is actually the crucial starting point for this entire deep dive.
All right.
Every civilization throughout human history suffers from this specific cognitive dissonance. They all believe, that their current system is the final, ultimate form of human organization.
The end of history, basically.
Exactly. And the authors draw a brilliant parallel here. They compare modern politicians in Washington or London to the Marxist nomenclatura in the dying days of the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow.
Or even the Chinese mandarins in the 19th century court of the emperor. Those elites actively ignored the mega-political earthquakes happening right under their feet.
Because acknowledging the shift meant acknowledging their own impending irrelevance, right?
Precisely. It's cognitive dissonance on a civilizational scale.
It's like you're sitting in the theater and you can see the stage is catching fire, but the actors are just delivering their lines louder.
That's a great way to put it.
The text points out that we're culturally conditioned to ignore the fire. We desperately want to believe that human wishes or opinion polls or voting actually shape the trajectory of history.
But they don't.
Right. And to understand why the world feels like it's decaying right now, we first have to shatter that grand illusion.
Which introduces the core and, frankly, esoteric reality check of the entire book, this concept of megapolitics.
Okay, let's unpack megapolitics.
So the authors argue that history isn't shaped by the art of how we organize ourselves. It's not driven by democratic tallies or philosophical breakthroughs or, the moral arcs of great leaders.
None of that matters.
According to the text, no. History is shaped by topography, climate, microbes, and primarily technology. These raw physical factors dictate what they call the natural economy.
The natural economy.
Yeah, and in a natural economy, outcomes are determined by one single thing, physical force.
So the argument here is that the control, and specifically the cost-effectiveness of violence, are the absolute only things that dictate social order.
Exactly.
Like, society doesn't obey the philosopher. It obeys the mathematics of violence.
To put it in the most unvarnished terms possible, people resort to violence because it pays. The simplest way to acquire wealth is to just take it. So the entire structure of any society, whether it's a nomadic hunter-gatherer band, a feudal kingdom, or a modern Western democracy, is really just an adaptation to the prevailing costs and rewards of projecting power.
And defending against violence, right?
Exactly.
Look, let me stop you there, because I have to push back on this. Playing the skeptical realist for a second. This sounds like an incredibly sociopathic way to read human history.
He is brutal, yes.
I mean, if we apply this logic, are we really saying that the French Revolution, the drafting of constitutions, the civil rights movement, all of it was just a shift in the cost-benefit analysis of violence? That strips away all human agency. Like, where is morality in this equation?
Well, the uncomfortable truth the text presents is that your very concept of morality is itself a byproduct of the economic and military realities of the era you happen to live in.
Wait, really? Morality is downstream of megapolitics.
That's the argument. To understand the mechanism, we have to look at the gunpowder revolution. The authors cite this as the perfect historical mirror to our current moment. Before gunpowder, during the Middle Ages, defense was vastly cheaper than offense.
Because of castles.
Right. A local lord in a stone castle with a few knights in heavy armor could successfully repel a massive invading army. So because power was inherently decentralized by the technology of the time, sovereignty was fragmented. You had thousands of tiny fiefdoms.
Right, because why conquer your neighbor if a siege takes 5 years and bankrupts you? The math of violence just doesn't support massive empires at that moment.
Exactly. But then the technology shifted. Cannons were invented.
And everything changes.
Completely. The mathematical equation of violence flips. Gunpowder made massed violence highly profitable. A cannon could reduce a castle wall to rubble in an afternoon.
So the local lord and his impregnable fortress are totally obsolete.
Instantly obsolete. To survive in the gunpowder age, you needed to organize violence on a massive scale. You needed massive infantry armies. But how do you pay for tens of thousands of soldiers? You need massive tax revenues. And to collect taxes on that scale across a vast territory, you needed a massive bureaucracy.
And just like that, the nation-state is born.
Yep.
Not out of a sudden enlightened desire for a shared national identity or a social contract, but strictly as a resource strategy to fund mass warfare.
That is the brutal underlying reality, and the text goes even further into this deconstruction. They argue that democracy itself wasn't a moral triumph.
Which is wild to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
They say democracy was a military resource strategy. When the technology of warfare evolved to the point where it required millions of men to stand in muddy trenches and die, think World War I, the state needed a mechanism to motivate them.
A king just demanding it wasn't enough anymore.
Right. Democracy and nationalism were the ideological tools constructed to mobilize the masses. They were mechanisms to justify the extortion of massive wealth through taxes and the conscription of human bodies.
To feed the industrial war machine.
Yeah.
That is a staggering way to look at it. So democracy is essentially a technological artifact of the industrial age.
A byproduct.
It's the ideological spoonful of sugar that makes mass conscription and mass taxation go down. If you give someone a vote, they feel like they own a piece of the state, so they're willing to die for it.
And pay for it.
But that leads to an incredibly dangerous logical conclusion. If the state only exists because industrial technology made mass armies necessary, and if the technology that requires mass armies disappears, then the entire justification for the nation-state disappears with it.
And you've just identified the megapolitical earthquake of our time.
The microchip.
Yes. The mass violence of the industrial era created the nation-state. But the shift to the information age, driven by microprocessing, fundamentally destroys the foundation of mass violence.
Because the returns on violence are dropping precipitously.
Right. You don't need 1 million men in trenches to hack an electrical grid or control a digital economy. And because the fundamental mechanism of power has shifted, we are currently watching the slow, senile, vicious death of the nation-state.
Which brings us to a fascinating pivot. If the only reason democracies exist is to tax citizens, to fund mass armies, and microprocessing makes mass armies obsolete, then what exactly is the purpose of the government today?
It's a great question.
We have to look at what the state actually is when you strip away the military necessity. And the text does this using a deeply cynical but unforgettable analogy, the farmer and the cows.
It is a devastating paradigm. The authors argue that once you remove the romanticism of the social contract, governments essentially treat their citizens the way a dairy farmer treats his cows.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, they keep you in a bounded physical field, a geographic territory with strict borders, merely so you can be milked for taxes.
Unbelievable.
Your passport, your national identity, your citizenship, these are just the tags on the cow's ear identifying which farmer holds the legal monopoly on milking you.
But the information age changes the biology of the herd. The text literally says, in cyberspace, the cows will have wings.
I love that line.
Me too. Let's break down the mechanics of how that actually works, because it's not just a poetic metaphor, right? It's a structural shift in economics.
The mechanism is encryption and decentralization. Information technology divorces wealth creation from physical geography.
Explain that a bit more.
Well, for the entirety of human history, wealth was physical. It was land, it was grain, it was factories, it was gold. And physical wealth is incredibly easy for a state to confiscate.
Right. A standing army can occupy a factory. A tax collector can seize a farm.
Exactly. But for the first time in history, the most valuable assets, information, algorithms, networks, encrypted financial transactions, they exist entirely outside of physical space.
And if a government cannot physically locate your wealth,
Or even prove you have it because it's locked behind cryptographic keys, they cannot use the threat of physical violence to extort it from you. Violence requires a physical target. Encryption removes the target.
I want to introduce a modern analogy here because it's so critical. It's like the shift from blockbuster movie studios to YouTube creators, but applied to violence and power.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it. In the 20th century, projecting power required massive infrastructure, the equivalent of $1 billion Hollywood studio. You needed a Pentagon. You needed aircraft carriers. You needed massive tax bases.
Right, huge sunk costs.
But microprocessing shrinks the scale. Today, a localized cartel or a decentralized network of hackers with consumer drones and laptops can project power and disrupt systems just as effectively in their localized area.
Yeah, you no longer need the massive apparatus of the state to wield influence.
Exactly. And if the state can no longer effectively monopolize violence or easily confiscate digital wealth, then the civic duties we've all internalized begin to look absurd.
Totally absurd. Paying taxes, loyalty to the flag, the moral imperative of the welfare state, the authors actually label these moral anachronisms.
Like a medieval knight clinging to the rules of chivalry after the invention of the cannon.
Yes.
Chivalry made perfect logical sense when protection was a localized, face-to-face, oath-based exchange between a lord and his vassals.
Yeah.
But once technology changed and cannons could blow right through the lord's armor, chivalry wasn't just outdated.
It became a comic absurdity, a suicide pact.
Right. And the text predicts that in the near future, the sacred civic duties of the 20th century will look equally absurd. As the state's ability to protect its citizens or guarantee economic stability erodes, its demands for patriotic duty and equality will be exposed for what they truly are.
Mechanisms to justify ongoing mass extortion. The state will demand loyalty, but it will be unable to offer anything of value in return.
It's like a dying subscription service that removes all its good content, doubles the price, and hides the cancel button. You're looking at it thinking, why am I still paying for this?
Exactly.
And the text points out that the growing corruption among Western leaders isn't just a random anomaly or a run of bad luck with elections. It's the senile decline of a dying system. They compare the modern political establishment to the corrupt Catholic Church clergy at the end of the 15th century, right before the Reformation.
The mechanics of that historical parallel are profound. At the end of the 15th century, the church was the predominant institution of the feudal era.
Right.
It held a monopoly on truth and salvation, much like the modern state holds a monopoly on violence and legality. But as the underlying economy shifted with the rise of mercantilism and the printing press began destroying the monopoly on information, the church became incredibly bloated, corrupt, and widely despised.
So what did they do?
To maintain their revenue streams, they started explicitly selling indulgences, literally monetizing sin.
And today we have governments running massive, unpayable deficits, inflating their currencies, and suffering from unprecedented terminal levels of public distrust.
It's the exact same dynamic.
Selling indulgences in 1490 is exactly like printing trillions in fiat currency today to prop up an unsustainable system. The politicians don't believe the platitudes they mouth on television, and the public doesn't believe them either. It's just a hollow ritual.
Yeah.
But this leads to a terrifying question. If the state is losing its monopoly on violence and its ability to extort wealth is drying up power abhors a vacuum, what fills it?
This is where the authors take a deeply deconstructionist Hobbesian view. As the state's monopoly fractures, power devolves downward. We will see the rise of literal mafias.
Mafias, like the mob.
Yeah, and they specifically use that term to describe ethnic criminal gangs, renegade covert agencies, or privatized military groups that become indistinguishable from the government itself. They call them microparasites feeding on a dying system.
Because microprocessing drastically reduces the size a group must attain to effectively use violence.
Right. Predatory violence organizes outside of central control.
So it's not a sudden, clean, utopian revolution. It's a terrifying, messy devolution. The big, organized extortion racket of the nation-state breaks down into 1,000 smaller, more localized, unpredictable shakedowns.
It gets very dark.
It does. But while the physical world descends into this fragmented, neo-feudal chaos, The text points to an entirely different reality emerging simultaneously in the digital realm.
The Cyber Olympus.
Yes, and this is where we transition from the collapse of the old system to the terrifying, yet supposedly liberating ascent of the sovereign individual. If the physical world is collapsing into localized mafias, who inherits the earth, or rather, who escapes it?
The ultimate winners, according to the text, are the new cognitive elite. As the institutional extortion racket collapses, those who can operate entirely within the digital realm achieve a level of autonomy never before seen in human history.
Wow.
The authors describe cyberspace as the ultimate offshore jurisdiction. It is a parallel economy with no geographic borders and, crucially, no taxes. They use the phrase Bermuda in the sky with diamonds.
Bermuda in the sky with diamonds. It's a beautifully surreal image. An ethereal realm where transactions are encrypted, immune from physical coercion. Right. The text actually points out how the magic of microtechnology mimics ancient Greek myths. Think about it. Passwords act like the abracadabra of genies. You type a string of characters, and a digital servant executes your commands across the globe instantly.
It's basically magic.
You can summon resources, communicate across oceans, and wield massive economic power without ever moving your physical body.
It is a profound shift in human capability. Individuals can project their presence globally, much like the gods of Greek mythology looking down from Mount Olympus.
Right.
But this new Cyber Olympus is characterized by something that makes modern sensibilities incredibly uncomfortable.
What's that?
It is an absolute, unforgiving meritocracy.
Right, and meritocracy is a word people throw around today as a positive ideal.
Yeah.
But the information age version described here is utterly ruthless. Cyberspace cares nothing for race, gender, age, physical appearance, or your geographic birthplace.
None of it matters.
It is a realm of utterly colorblind anonymity. If you have the cognitive ability and the ideas, you win. If you don't, you lose. There's no union, no diversity mandate, no geographic protectionism to save you.
Which brings us to the end of what the authors brutally categorize as unearned advantage. We have to look at the mechanics of global inequality today.
Okay, let's look at that.
Currently, the top 15% of the world's population, mostly residing in Western industrial nations, hoards a massive income advantage over the rest of the world. The text notes a $21,000 average premium.
Just for living in the right country.
Exactly. Even unskilled labor in a rich country earns vastly more than highly skilled labor in a poor country, simply because they are geographically tethered to a wealthy nation-state. Their premium is enforced by border walls and immigration laws.
But the cyber economy severs that tether. A brilliant programmer in Mumbai or Lagos can compete directly with a programmer in Silicon Valley for the exact same wage because the work is entirely digital.
Exactly. That massive artificial global inequality between nations will evaporate. But the internal inequality within those former nation-states will skyrocket to levels we haven't seen since the pharaohs.
Okay, here is where I have to aggressively push back on this Cyber Olympus vision.
Okay, go for it.
I get the digital mechanics, but you're assuming sovereign individuals won't need physical infrastructure. Like, a digital billionaire with $1 billion in Bitcoin still needs physical roads to transport their goods. They need physical food grown in physical dirt. They need a physical military or private security force to stop a local warlord from just cutting their fiber optic cables or poisoning their water supply. You can't live in the cloud. Doesn't the physical reality fundamentally break the author's cyber utopia? How does society not completely tear itself apart if the rich digitally secede?
Well, the authors don't argue that society won't tear itself apart. In fact, they argue it will.
Well then.
Yeah, you are asking how the system survives, and their answer is it doesn't. You are applying the moral anachronisms of the industrial welfare state to a new era. The harsh inevitability of the text is that the state simply will not have the funds to redistribute wealth anymore, nor the funds to maintain that public physical infrastructure.
Because it can't tax the digital wealth.
Exactly. The state can no longer charge more for its services than they are actually worth on the open market.
Because if a government tries to raise taxes to fix the roads or fund welfare, the wealthy will just leave. They will take their digital wealth, hire private security for their physical bodies, and bounce to a cheaper, more compliant jurisdiction.
Precisely. The sovereign individuals will privatize their own physical security. They will live in gated, heavily defended enclaves.
So individuals become customers of jurisdictions, shopping for the best tax rates and security packages.
Yes. Citizenship, as an identity and a moral duty, dies completely. Consumerism replaces it. Governments will no longer be sovereign rulers. They will be reduced to competing security corporations, desperately trying to attract the cognitive elite to reside in their territory.
Citizenship dies, consumerism replaces it. If you really internalize that, it is a chilling sentence. It means the end of the social fabric as we know it.
It does.
But this leads perfectly into our next realization. If the elite are escaping to this digital Olympus and privatizing their lives, the nation-state and the masses of people left behind are not going to just quietly pack it in and accept their fate.
No, they won't.
The dying system is going to thrash. And this brings us to the most dangerous taboo ideas in the entire book.
The transition crisis. The state will not starve to death peacefully. Like an angry farmer realizing his cows are growing wings and flying out of the pen, the dying nation-state will use desperate, violent authoritarian measures to tether its escaping herd.
Let's talk about how the state strikes back, because the text maps this onto current global decay with terrifying accuracy. We aren't just talking about higher tax brackets.
Not at all.
The text predicts governments will resort to arbitrary forfeiture of property, literally just seizing assets, because they have the physical force to do so. They predicted massive censorship to control the flow of liberating information, hostage-taking. And my favorite phrase, wetting the IRS with the CIA.
The mechanics of capital flight force the state's hand. When traditional tax collection fails because wealth is encrypted, the intelligence apparatus turns inward.
To spy on its own citizens.
Exactly. The tools previously used to spy on foreign enemies are deployed against domestic citizens to monitor transactions, prevent capital from leaving the border, and preserve the dying tax base. Every financial transaction becomes an act of surveillance.
Wow.
And when direct taxation and surveillance ultimately fail to balance the budget, the state resorts to the ultimate, most insidious covert tax inflation.
I really want to spend time unpacking inflation because it is so relevant to the listener's daily life right now.
Oh, absolutely.
The text's view on fiat currency, paper money backed by nothing but the government's promise, is brutal. They argue that inflation is not an economic accident. It is a deliberate policy of theft.
That's a great way to describe it.
It's like someone sneaking into your liquor cabinet every night, pouring out a shot of your expensive whiskey and replacing it with water. You look at the bottle, and it still looks full. The numbers in your bank account still look the same. But the purchasing power, the proof of the whiskey, has been silently stolen from you.
And the tragic irony, the truly ruthless reality the authors point out, is that only the poor and the middle class will suffer from this inflation tax.
Why is that?
Because the wealthy, the sovereign individuals, will have already moved their assets into decentralized, mathematically secure assets. It's astonishing that this book, written in 1997, predicted the rise of cryptocurrencies.
It really is.
They explicitly described mathematical algorithms that have no physical existence, superseding fiat money issued by governments.
Spooky how accurate that is. So you have a scenario where the poor and the middle class are trapped in hyperinflating national currencies, literally watching their love savings evaporate.
Yep.
While the cognitive elite are transacting globally in borderless, deflationary cyber money, that is a recipe for absolute biblical fury.
Which brings us to the demographic the text calls the losers and left behinds, the neo-Luddite backlash. Who exactly are these people?
The psychological profile the authors build here is fascinating and pretty uncomfortable. The backlash won't just come from the absolute poorest in society.
Okay, who then?
The most dangerous, violent reaction will come from the middle talent in currently rich countries. Think of the credentialed classes. People who played by the rules of the 20th century industrial system, got the degrees, bought into the civic myths, and now face severe downward mobility.
Right. They are the primary beneficiaries of organized compulsion and redistributed income. They will see the new freedom of the sovereign individual not as liberation, but as a direct existential threat to their survival.
So they will have a deep nostalgia for compulsion. They will want the government to force people back into the box.
Exactly.
They will want borders closed, tariffs raised, and capital trapped. But they won't say it like that, will they? I mean, people don't generally march in the streets demanding to be subsidized by someone else's extorted wealth.
No, they need a narrative.
And this is where the authors brutally deconstruct human nature with a concept they call the moral toupee. Let's dig deep into this because it changes how you see every political headline.
The moral toupee is a brilliant psychological concept. The book describes it as a bald desire fitted with a moral toupee.
I love that.
The authors argue that naked, self-interested grasping rarely motivates people to violence. People need to feel justified. What motivates people is self-righteous fury. The raw resentment of the left behind's their fear of losing status and wealth will be disguised as high-minded morality.
So nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, hatred of the information elite, demands for wealth taxes.
Right.
All of these isms and political movements are just primal biological instincts dressed up in a suit of moral outrage.
Great.
The text actually delves heavily into evolutionary biology here, mentioning concepts like inclusive fitness and interference competition. Break down the science of that for us. How is a protectionist trade policy actually just ape behavior?
Okay, so in evolutionary biology, interference competition occurs when organisms gain control over scarce resources, not by being faster or more efficient at gathering them, but by directly fighting off or hampering their rivals.
So it's essentially sabotage.
It's pure sabotage. The authors argue that as the economic pie shrinks for the middle talent in the West, they will revert to this primal biological behavior. Since they cannot compete on pure merit or efficiency in the new cyber economy, they will try to use the decaying apparatus of the state to hamper their rivals.
Right.
They will demand regulations to cripple tech elites, tariffs to block global markets, and borders to block immigrant labor. And they will justify this sabotage using the old civic myths of nationalism.
Which appeals directly to our biological instinct for inclusive fitness, the evolutionary drive to favor our own genetic tribe over outsiders.
Exactly.
This is such a crucial point. When a politician gets up to a podium and rails against globalists, or demands tariffs to protect national jobs, or wants to tax tech billionaires out of existence, they aren't actually fighting for a higher moral good. They're executing a biological survival script.
They are engaging in interference competition.
They're trying to kneecap the fast runners because they know they can't win the race.
That is the unflinching conclusion of the text. The moral imperatives of the 20th century will be weaponized by the neo-Luddites in a desperate, violent attempt to stop the information revolution.
But it won't work.
As the authors consistently warn, technological imperatives always win out over popular opinion in the long run. The math of violence dictates the outcome. The transition will be violent, it will be chaotic, and it will be dressed up in moral outrage, but it is ultimately inevitable.
Which brings us to our final act. We've autopsied the present decay. We've deconstructed the historical illusions. Now we have to cast an unflinching vision into the future based on the logical extremes of these sources.
Right, the radical horizon.
If the state collapses into localized mafias and the elite secede into digital and physical enclaves, what is that radical horizon? What does the map of the world actually look like in 50 years?
We are looking at a return to what the authors call the law of the march. In the Middle Ages, before the nation-state consolidated power, the marches were borderlands, where sovereignties overlapped, blended, and competed.
Central authority was incredibly weak or non-existent.
Yes. We will see the return of that fragmented map. We will see the rise of merchant republics in cyberspace, functioning very much like the medieval Hanseatic League.
Let's remind the listener about the Hanseatic League. It was an alliance of merchant guilds and market towns in northwestern Europe that essentially acted as its own sovereign power.
That's right.
They had their own laws, their own private militaries to protect trade routes, simply because the kings and lords of the time were too weak or too corrupt to provide security.
Exactly. They privatized sovereignty. We are entering an era of techno-feudalism. Private associations, digital networks, and corporate entities will emerge to provide protection, enforce contracts, and arbitrate disputes, entirely taking over the roles that governments have abandoned or failed to perform.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
It will be a world where honor, cryptographic reputation, and raw merit dictate survival, much like it did before the rise of the industrial nation-state.
So why does all of this matter to you, the listener? Why should you care about this brutal, unvarnished deconstruction of society? The text has a fantastic, terrifying quote. The universe rewards us for understanding it and punishes us for not understanding it. If we try to fly by, jumping off a cliff and flapping our arms, the universe will kill us.
That's perfectly stated. Disorientation in a time of transition breeds catastrophic mistakes.
Yeah.
If you cling to the 20th century illusions of democratic safety, if you rely on a shared national identity, or if you build your life around the expectation that the government will always be there to provide a safety net or a stable currency, you are jumping off the cliff flapping your arms.
Because the mega-political realities, the underlying physics of power, have changed beneath your feet.
You must adapt to an era where the privatization of sovereignty is the new reality.
You have to cultivate the skills to become a sovereign individual, or you will be crushed by the dying, violent thrashing of the nation-state. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply unsettling extrapolation. If we take the sociobiological undertones of this text to their absolute logical extreme, it leads somewhere incredibly dark.
It leads to the ultimate divergence.
Yes. The text mentions repeatedly that human desires are shaped by Darwinian survival. It outlines how the cognitive elite will separate themselves economically and physically from the masses. Well, let's play that out over a century.
Let's hear it.
If the sovereign individuals completely untether themselves from the rest of humanity, if they live in heavily armed, private, climate-controlled enclaves or floating digital jurisdictions, and if they transact exclusively in encrypted cyber money.
And critically, if they utilize their vast wealth to access advanced biotechnology, radical life extension, and integrated artificial intelligence.
Exactly. If this cognitive elite only breeds, interacts, and transacts with each other over multiple generations, protected by impenetrable walls of encryption and private security, while the rest of humanity is left to fight over the scraps of a decaying physical world, will this economic separation eventually lead to literal biological speciation?
Wow. It is the most terrifying, indifferent reality to contemplate, the divergence of humanity into two distinct biological paths based on economic and cognitive capacity.
Are we not just witnessing the death of the nation-state, but the fracturing of the human species itself? Are we watching the birth of a post-human Olympus, leaving the rest of the world behind in the dirt to slowly go extinct?
It is a horrifying thought.
And it's exactly the kind of muddy, uncharted, dangerous territory where the old maps no longer apply. Something for you to ponder as you log off and step back into the remnants of the modern world.